you have that you feel like would help prep you better for the next exam, or that I could implement for future students, definitely let me know. All right, the recording is started. All right, so for that, where did it go? Oh, I know where it went. It's over here in a completely different place. So for Unit 2, we're starting that today. We will most likely have a discussion and an activity today regarding the zone of proximal development. You've heard about that before, and hopefully you read about it as well. Your SMART book is coming up on Thursday for this first chapter in this unit, which is Chapter 5. So essentially we've got Chapter 5, 6, 7, and 8, our Unit 2, and then we've got our Unit 2 exam. So with that, most of these chapters actually have activities. I don't remember if there is one for 8. I was trying to make one, but I don't remember if I did make an activity yet. But with that as well, we do have our midterm question paper. So keep that in mind. It's definitely going to be easier for you to do it early rather than later. At this point, though, you might not have found a question that's really interesting for you to write a paper on. So hopefully, as we're going through these chapters on early to middle childhood, you'll find some topics that are interesting to you, that connect with you personally in some way. So then you can take that topic and do some research on it. So in my email yesterday, I sent a link for how to do a question paper. I know we talked about it in class, and most of you were all here. But it's a good little review. If you don't remember how to find research, you can look at that. So do keep in mind that your question paper will be due basically the same day the exam opens. So if you start that question paper at the end of this week, you're going to have that exam as well as that question paper to finish, and so that'll put a little more stress on you. So starting the question paper here, finding some articles this next weekend or something like that, and then writing a first draft the following weekend, and then finishing up the paper on the 26th and 27th, and then turning it in before you're starting to study for your exam would be a good idea to get started, and then you can do it in little chunks. So it's not a very long paper, just 2 pages minimum with a page of references and 3 sources, 2 of those peer-reviewed. So yeah, if you're having trouble figuring out questions as it gets to probably the 25th or so, if you still haven't come up with a good topic question, send me an email and I'll send you some ideas of what other students have done for question papers in the past, and that might jog your ideas, make you think of something. But with that, let's get jumping into Chapter 5. Unless there are any other questions about logistics or what we're doing with class and things of that nature. All right, so we will be covering physical and cognitive development in early childhood. So early childhood, again, is about ages of 3 to 5, and then we will jump into middle childhood in the next couple chapters. So we're going to kind of breeze over a lot of the physical changes. So your book goes into a lot more depth on physical changes than we will today. We're going to go in a lot more depth onto cognitive, language development, and early childhood education than your book does. But we will talk a little bit about physical changes. So body growth and development. So at this age, so again, in between about 3 to age 5, the average child grows about 2.5 inches per year and gains about 5 to 7 pounds a year. So most of that growth is just lengthening of bodies, so just growing taller. On average, girls tend to be slightly smaller until about puberty, where they kind of shoot up quicker because they generally, on average, enter puberty earlier. So the bodies are lengthening. At this time, so before about the age of 5, any kind of body variations that you see, so being shorter or heavier or taller or slimmer, most of that is due to genetics. So like we've talked about, there are other things that can affect it. Nutrition is one of the big environmental factors that can affect that. So while genetically you might be pre-programmed to grow quite tall, if you're not eating healthily, you might not reach the height you might be genetically pre-programmed to get to, as an example. But also children, so on average, generally, children who are heavier, most of that is from genetics and just the way their body is processing the nutrients that's going into them. But it is possible for children to have childhood obesity even at these ages too. But like I said, most of the variation that you'll see in children at this age is due to genetics. So brain development is also really important at every point in the lifespan. So we talked about how up to about age 2, the brain is getting all the neurons to their proper place. So at this time in early childhood, all the neurons are in their proper place. The brain is set up the right way. Every neuron is there, and what we're dealing with now is things like myelination and dendrites and axon branches extending all throughout. And that's basically what we're dealing with throughout all of life for brain plasticity. So the overall size doesn't really change at this time in life, but it does become a lot more dense. So we are pruning away still after age 2 a lot of connections that aren't needed, but we are strengthening connections of things that are being used. So there is a lot more density. So when the brain is less dense, that means there's probably less connections between things. So actually being low income is a risk factor for less density in the brain. So you can look at the brains of children at different income levels and actually see a difference in the density. And so you can imagine why that might be. Maybe children who are in low income don't have access to as many toys or as many learning resources or as many people that they can interact with or something like that, because their parents might have to work more and more hours a day. So that is a risk factor for having less density of neuron connections. Versus maternal sensitivity is actually a protective factor. So if we look at a scale of maternal sensitivity, or we look at attachment between children, and we see this mother versus this mother versus this mother, this one is really sensitive and quick to respond, that kind of thing, understands what their child is saying, versus this one is about average and this one's not as good at it. We can see that those who have higher maternal sensitivity tend to have higher density in their neurons and in their brain. So with that kind of care and concern and interaction with a primary caregiver is correlated to having more density in the brain. That might be a causal relationship, just like low income is correlated. So it's not I might have used some causal language there, so sorry, even I make that mistake sometimes. But there's other variables there, probably with maternal sensitivity, that helps protect and encourage that kind of brain development. So another clear example, hopefully, for you to see and wrap your head around of what could be a risk factor for brain development and what could be a protective factor. So that sensitivity can be a protective factor as well. You might imagine things like close friendships might be a protective factor later on in childhood and adolescence. It is, spoiler alert, but yeah. So with that, the prefrontal cortex is growing really dramatically. So like we've talked about, a lot of the development kind of happens from the base of the brain, kind of as a wave throughout the brain and kind of in the middle out as well. So the prefrontal cortex is one of the last to finish, but even at this time, there's lots of new connections being made in the prefrontal cortex. A lot of myelination happening there, even though it doesn't complete until early 20s, and a lot of dendrites connecting up. So with that, do we remember what the prefrontal cortex does, or a couple of its tasks? Why is it important, and why do I keep bringing it up? Does anyone want to list a thing or two that the prefrontal cortex does? Oh, interesting. I'm getting notifications not on my computer, but it's going to my app just fine. So hopefully you are hearing and seeing me right now, because Oops, my meeting chat is not updating. Oh, there it goes. They all appeared. Just, I wonder if my computer was just disconnected or for a minute. So hopefully you were hearing me. It looks like you were answering. Sorry about that. So yeah, a lot of good answers here. Judgment in this area, so making decisions, planning, maintaining attention, decision making, role playing in organization. Yeah, definitely. Personality development is partially affected by the prefrontal cortex, and looking at yourself, who you are, things like that. At this time in life, we wouldn't necessarily call what the child has personality yet, but it's definitely the beginning stages of like personality, understanding that they are a different person, and that also is related to identity development as well. Strategic thinking, goal setting, behavior planning. Yeah, really good. So sorry, you were all answering basically everything the prefrontal cortex does, but for some reason it wasn't coming up on my screen. So I apologize for that. All right, great work. So you've got a good understanding of the prefrontal cortex. That's really good. You'll find things like this that come up more than just in the chapter that they were in are probably one of the things that'll end up on you seeing on your final exam. So the final exam, I didn't mention this earlier. I meant to when we were talking about the exam. The final exam is semi-cumulative. So it's mostly, so about 60% of the exam is over just the last 4 chapters. But the rest of the exam, about 40% of the exam, covers the earlier chapters. So you'll see some of these same topics like prefrontal cortex and what it does and why it's important. You'll see that in questions on the final. So there's about 40% of it that come from exams 1, 2, and 3 material, and then most of it, 60% of the final exam, come from the most recent unit at that point. So just to keep that in mind, so you don't just abandon all that you've learned from Unit 1. So you can review that every once in a while and remember these things. And just know that things that come up multiple times, like what is the prefrontal cortex and why is it important, are probably those things that you'll see repeated in the final exam. All right, so motor development in early childhood. So again, keep in mind the age ranges. If you have family members or friends or something like that, or even children yourself that are in this age, you can think of them and where they might be in their development here. So moving around in the environment with gross motor skills, so running, jumping, playing, is a lot easier and automatic at this point in early childhood. With that, at age 3, they should be pretty adept at hopping, jumping, running. Age 4, climbing and testing limits. So if you go to, say, a playground, they will probably be trying to do more than, as a parent, you want them to do. So my child just turned 4 over the weekend, actually. And I noticed this at a park. I mean, it's hard because we haven't really been going to many parks because of the virus, but there's no one there now because it's cold outside. And they're also wearing their big mittens. So it's like, it's pretty safe. They're not actually touching things. So we've been going to parks a little bit recently. And so essentially he had almost a year away from parks. And now to see the abilities that he's trying to do, this limit testing right now, it's exactly what I did, exactly what his sister did when they were that age. But it's sometimes scary to watch. At age 5, much more adventurous, much more likely to take risks, a lot of control over the gross motor systems. If you think of it, if you've ever seen someone doing parkour, a 5-year-old should be pretty able to learn most parkour movements, do well in things like gymnastics. With training, obviously someone age 3 or 4 could get better and do something like gymnastics, something that's really technical and requires a lot of fine movement and control over their body. But just on average, just with general play, this is about where children should be at these points. So with that, if children aren't meeting these benchmarks, oftentimes they're left out of peer groups that are playing games. So if you can't actually run around a house fast enough to play tag or hide or play soccer or something like that, you'll probably not be picked for a team or probably not be involved in those teams. So that is a motor skill connecting to a socio-emotional interaction of playing a team sport. And so that's correlated with lower motivation for sports, lower self-worth. So when you see all your friends teaming up and playing a game and you're left out of it, that can lead to lower self-worth, or is at least correlated. There probably is a causal relationship there, though. So with this, fine motor skills are still pretty clumsy in early childhood. So at age 3, they're probably able to pick up things like Legos and manipulate Legos, but creating a Lego creation like this might be really difficult for them. If they're playing with Legos all the time, it's something they're intrinsically motivated to do, they can develop those fine motor skills quicker, just on average at age 3. Still, it's going to be a little harder for them to create more complicated Lego creations. At age 4, they're going to be more precise, more capable of doing what they want to do, but still it might be a struggle at times. By age 5, their coordination, their fine motor control, especially with their fingers and their hands and their eyes, should be pretty well coordinated. So you can think of this applying to things like playing the piano as well. It's going to be really a struggle for someone at age 3, but then at age 5, that might be a good time to work on that. Obviously, though, again, here we talked about Lego as an example. If you're practicing piano, if it's something they're intrinsically motivated to do, or guitar or any instrument that's requiring fine motor control, they can get better with that specific training and effort in that specific area. So what a child eats is really going to affect their skeletal growth, how quickly they grow. Like I said, most of the variations we see around are mostly genetic, but the biggest other factor after genetics is nutrition. So the brain development, body shape, susceptibility to disease, all those are patterns that the body is getting right now, and you can have risk factors and protective factors at this time based on child's diet. So healthy habits are really important. So having kids eat a full and balanced diet with lots of vitamins, minerals, vegetables, and fruits are really important. Eating with children tends to help on average. Children eat a little better. Some other things is also modeling healthy eating. So as a parent or as a caregiver, as an aunt or something like that, model that healthy eating to children, that you're eating healthily, talking about it. My kids know we're doing a keto diet, and so they'll often ask when we offer them a treat, they'll be like, is this keto? Because they don't like the non-sugary flavors of it. So hopefully we're modeling it in a good way. Having fun at mealtime can help, especially with younger kids, getting them cooking early. It can be messy and frustrating, but it can be really rewarding. They will tend to, on average, eat more of what they've created themselves, so because it's interesting to them. So those are some tips and tricks. With that being said, it doesn't always work. My child almost never eats vegetables. The youngest is basically a fruitarian, eats fruits and very little else. So it's hard to figure out what a child will eat, and even trying to get them to make things and whatnot, and modeling healthy habits. His older sister even loves salads and vegetables. Literally at bedtime, rather than asking for like a granola bar, she'll be like, hey, can I have a lettuce leaf? So she's probably just trying to put off bedtime, but it's like, well, that's healthy. Yeah, sure. So it can be a challenge, though. So with being overweight in early childhood, again, nutrition is the biggest factor after genetics for body sizes and changes. So with that, some kids are eating too many trans fats, and this can put them at higher risk. So it's a risk factor for higher cholesterol later on in their life and an increased risk of heart disease. So something to be cognizant of even in these early years. So in a survey, French fries and fried potatoes were one of the most common vegetables for kids to eat in 2010. I wish my youngest would eat French fries. It would make things so much easier, especially on road trips. Have to plan a whole set of snacks and meals to take, rather than just like stopping in and getting French fries in a drive-through. So about 12% of 2 to 5-year-olds are obese. This study, I didn't put the date here. I should have put the date. but that was compared to 1980, which is higher. So longitudinal studies show that an overweight child is more likely to be overweight as well in adulthood. So there is a causal relationship there. So for malnutrition especially, there are supports that exist. So children of low income families often don't get the vitamins or proteins or minerals that they need. And so WIC is an example of one of these programs. It's a federal program. It basically provides states with grants. So federal money coming to states saying, hey, give this to kids to eat better. So, and that's for children up to age 5 to be able to buy healthy foods. So having those more healthy foods or having a good diet is correlated with these positive benefits. So a healthy diet is a protective factor and also correlated with cognitive benefits, so like prefrontal cortex tasks, a higher reading levels, and overall more healthy kids. So diet is a really important thing. Another big thing for children in early childhood is exercise and activity. You might not call it exercise at this time, you might just call it play or activity. So they need to be physically active every day. So the recommendations are like 15 minutes per hour or about 3 hours total per day that they should be moving around, playing around, rather than just like playing a video game. This is like active physical play. So with this, one thing that really helps is to center a child's life around activities. So in the morning, we're going to play soccer. In the afternoon, we're going to draw or something like that. So plan activities. I know, at least for myself as a parent, sometimes it's easier to like divide the day into like meal times. So after breakfast, we've got or before breakfast, there's a couple tasks to do. Then after breakfast, there's a couple tasks. And then there's lunchtime around 11:30 for my kids. So there's things we've got to do before then. So it's really easy to plan around like those meal times. But the best thing to do is actually plan around activities that a child will do. So plan, hey, this morning we're going to be doing these things, and the afternoon we're going to be doing these things, or this morning, do you want to do X, Y, or Z? So plan around activities to encourage a child to play, give them options or opportunities to play. The Floor is Lava. It's a really fun game that is very active and gives children the gross motor tasks that they might want to do or need to do at this age, as an example. So there's lots of options, team sports, other things. So with that, physical development, also death is related to the physical development. So most deaths in the US for early childhood are accidents or unintentional injuries. So that can include a lot of things like falling, drowning as an example. So that is the most common. So trying to still keep a house safe. And you can imagine that happening as they're testing physical limits, jumping, breaking bones, things like that. Birth defects, deformities, and chromosomal abnormalities are some of the next common causes of death. So tobacco smoke is a risk factor for a lot of health problems later on. And so at this time, it's generally secondhand tobacco smoke, right? So it's a higher risk of wheezing, asthma, and sleep problems, even sleep problems in childhood, and asthma developing earlier on, as well as risk factors for later on in life. So things to watch out for and be concerned with. All right, so that is all we're going to talk about in regards to physical development. I want to spend more time on cognitive development and some of the socio-emotional development for early childhood. So if there's any questions of things that you read in the chapter in physical development, definitely feel free to ask them or put them in the chat for sure. But we'll move on to cognitive right now. So Piaget, and as we discussed before, Piaget made a lot of observations about children and set up these different stages, sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational, to describe how children were thinking and processing information. So as we discussed before, most of these observations were pretty good, but generally children are able to do them earlier than Piaget observed and thought. There wasn't a lot of empirical testing, so there wasn't like experiments to test, are they doing this task or this task? How are they doing this task? So in the later years, we've built on this. So while we don't talk about this as being a stage, there are some relevant things that we learned from Piaget that we've brought up to now. So we'll see some of that right now. So the pre-operational stage was essentially a time when a child is forming a concept of the world, and they're starting to use words to represent the world, and they tend to be egocentric, which sounds bad, but it's really just defined as an inability to distinguish between themselves and others' perspectives. So we brought this up a couple times. Theory of mind. So the theory of mind is essentially the idea that a child understands that they themselves is an individual aside and apart from other people who have their own goals, their own ideas, their own thoughts. So at this time, Piaget observed that a lot of children are egocentric, that they're focused on their own perspectives. They don't really understand or see or process others' perspectives. And so that's fairly accurate. We develop past that earlier than Piaget thought, but it was a good observation. So, but again, this isn't like a negative connotation like, oh, kids are so selfish. That's not what this is saying. That's saying that children are processing in a way that they don't understand other people's perspectives yet. They don't have that cognitive capacity. So it's a developmental phenomena. It's not a bad thing. Yeah. So this is essentially the same as theory of mind. Let's watch one of these. We did mention this theory of mind test earlier, but let's actually watch some kids do it at a couple different ages in early childhood, and I think it'll make things a little more clear. Also, let me know if you are unable to hear this as I get it started, or that you can't see it or anything like that as it starts.
You're gonna have a tea party with Play-Doh. I want to serve myself. Here, Sarah. No!
Well, you've probably discovered that however smart your 3-year-old is, she doesn't seem able to put herself in someone else's mental shoes, to imagine how they think and what they believe. Perhaps you thought your parenting skills were to blame, but scientists suggest that understanding other minds is a skill that may not be fully developed until a child is about 4. To learn how children's social skills evolve between about 3 and 4, researchers use something called a false belief test. What do you think's in this box? Looks fairly obvious, doesn't it? Crayons. But let me show you. I filled it full of candles. All right, now I close it up again. While you and I have been having this conversation, Snoopy has been down here asleep. Doesn't know what we've talked about. But let's bring him into the conversation. Now I have another question for you. What do you think Snoopy will say if I ask him what's in this box? Crayons, obviously. What else could anybody possibly say? Well, watch this 3-year-old.
What do you think is inside this box? Okay, let's open it up and see.
Candle.
Now, you can ask the child what appears to be a very simple question about that. What did you think was inside the box when you first saw it? They say, oh, I always thought that there were candles in this box. Then you can ask them about someone else. So you can ask them about Snoopy. Snoopy's been sitting here. He hasn't seen this box. He's never seen us open it up. What does Snoopy think is inside this box?
Candles.
Children say the same thing. Snoopy will think there are candles inside of this box. And what that indicates is that the children's view of how minds work is very, very different from the view that you and I would have. Did you see it?
In the mind of the 3-year-old, everyone sees the world much the same way. There's no difference between what I think and believe and what everyone else, including Snoopy, thinks and believes. It is, in a sense, a naive and innocent view of the world, a kind of mental Eden. And then, about 4, comes the fall from grace.
Now, if you take the 4-year-old, quite typically the 4-year-old will tell you that, as a matter of fact, he thought there were crayons in the box, and then he found out that there were candles in the box. You can ask him about Snoopy, and he'll say, oh no, Snoopy will think that there are crayons in this box. Great, why will he think that?
Because it's a crayon box.
That's right, and that's going to make him think they're crayons. What's really in the box?
Candles.
Right. And then you get the 5-year-olds who are just utterly blasé and think that this is such an obvious thing, it's silly even to ask the question. What that shows is that by the time children are 4 and 5, they have a view of the mind that looks much more like our view of the mind. They understand that things can be tricky and deceptive, that you can change your mind, that things aren't always the way that they seem. And that gives them a very different vision of how the mind works and how people work.
Remember, we're sharing this. Well, I need that. And then it's my turn.
Children who pass the false belief test now understand that other people can have different beliefs, even mistaken beliefs. Some scientists suggest that this test is further evidence of innate brain circuits specialized for reading other people's minds. They call it a theory of mind mechanism.
It's kind of a funny way to say it, a brain mechanism for reading others' minds. I understand why they put it there, make it sound more flashy. But basically, many researchers think that there might be an innate built neural system that essentially once it gets all wired up, now we can now understand that other people have a different perspective. So this is something that can develop a little earlier or a little bit later, depending on the child, their experience, if they're having more or less social experience, if people are talking more or less about their feelings. But around that time is generally when it happens. So that theory of mind mechanism is basically how we describe what we think might be an innate capacity to develop a theory of mind. So it might not actually be an innate capacity, but it does seem like on average most people do gain that ability to distinguish that theory of mind task about the same time. So again, this goes back to the problem of also doing this kind of observational study of a child of this age. So what we can do is set up a test like this. So have the crayon box, have something else in it, and ask questions in this kind of scenario. Piaget did similar things at some points, but depending on the kinds of questions you ask, the kind of tasks that you put in front of them, depending on what you're doing, it sometimes seems like they might have a theory of mind or they might not. So overall, the prevailing evidence suggests, though, that about between 3 and 4 is when this kind of clicks on average for most kids. I know for my son, it seems like it's still a little difficult to understand outside of humans that he has a sense of that other people have a different perspective and that they have boundaries, things like that. I'm not sure he gets that with animals, with the cats that we have running around the house, that they might not want to be pet when he's wanting to pet them, or maybe just doesn't care, really wants to pet him anyway. So again, this may develop earlier, depends on the child, their social experience, but these kind of observational and behavioral methods are some of the best ways we have to test them. But if a better method is made, we can't obviously plug in a child into the matrix and see what they're seeing and give them a whole simulation and understand what's happening entirely neurologically. But when we can get closer to that, we might have a better idea. So when you're talking about emotions frequently, when you're talking about your perspective or others around them are talking about their perspectives to a child, they're able to gain this capacity earlier. It's also correlated to better executive functioning, better planning, better goal settings, and a lot of prefrontal cortex development is probably tied to getting this theory of mind wired up, essentially. So we might have a theory of mind mechanism, but we might not. One suggestion for children with autism is it does seem like they have a harder time developing this theory of mind. Now, that might be down to maybe they are having a harder time developing a theory of mind. It also might be down to these observational tests don't work as well for someone who's neurodivergent. So it might be we need to test it a different way with neurotypical versus neurodivergent children to really see. So one suggestion has been that they might not have an innate theory of mind mechanism, or it might be that this theory of mind mechanism isn't actually innate, that it's learned easier by a neurotypical child than a neurodivergent child. It also might be that our observational methods aren't really suited to a neurodivergent child to actually assess whether they're doing this theory of mind and they actually have that grasp. So areas to research further there. And there is a lot of research on autism in this age range. So if you are interested in autism or theory of mind and autism as a question paper in early childhood, your biggest problem would probably be narrowing down which articles are the most relevant to looking at it rather than finding any articles. So a good topic if it's something you're interested in. So you might have seen Piaget's conservation of mass tests before. I find them to be pretty interesting to see children's brains processing, and you might actually try this with your own children or nieces or nephews or other kids that are in your life.
Two rows of quarters. Okay. Does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
The same.
The same? Okay, now watch. Now, does this row have more quarters? Does this row have more quarters, or are they the same?
That one has more quarters.
That one has more quarters?
Yeah.
Why does that one have more quarters?
Because it's stretched out.
Because it's stretched out?
Yeah.
Okay, so how many are in this row?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Okay, how many are in this row?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So, are there more in this row, or are they the same?
The same.
The same?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so we have two sticks. Is this stick longer? Is this stick longer, or are they the same?
The same.
The same? What about now? Is this stick longer? Is this stick longer, or are they the same?
That stick is longer.
The stick is longer?
Yeah.
Can you tell me why?
Because you moved it over.
So now it's longer.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me. I'm going to pour blue water into each of these cups, and you're going to have to tell me when they have the same amount, okay? Okay, tell me when this one is the same.
The same.
The same? Those two are the same now?
Yeah.
Okay. See? Good.
The white is the same. Huh?
Good. Okay, now watch this. We're going to take the blue water from this glass. We're going to pour it into this glass. Now, does this glass have more water? Does this glass have more water, or are they the same?
Has more water.
This one has more water?
Yeah.
Can you tell me why?
Because that one's higher than that one.
That one's higher than that one. Right. Can you tell me, does this ball have more Play-Doh? Does this ball have more Play-Doh, or are they the same?
That one has more Play-Doh.
That one has more?
Yeah.
Let's try and make them the same. Make them two of the same size. What about now?
They're the same.
They're the same now?
Yeah.
Okay, now watch. Now, does this one have more Play-Doh? Does this one have more Play-Doh, or are they the same?
That one has more Play-Doh.
That one has more Play-Doh? Can you tell me why?
You smushed that one.
Because that one's smushed. How about?
So there's a couple examples. I mean, it's not very much longer, but I think that gives plenty of examples of this process of being able to understand the conservation of mass. That mass, when that Play-Doh is squished, it's not actually changing its mass. When the water is poured into a taller glass, it's still the same amount of water or blue juice or whatever it is. So this was something that Piaget used in one of the more empirical tests that he did. Children in early childhood often have a hard time mentally reversing events that happen. So even if a child is watching that water be poured, it seems like it's hard for them to process and reverse and remember, oh, it is actually the same amount of water. It's now just in a taller glass. So there's a couple different cognitive processes happening here, or probably happening here, to lead to these kinds of responses. So more recent research suggests that if you use different methods, so as you saw here, Piaget used the water example. Here in this example, they used the coins, the sticks, the Play-Doh. So when you use different questions and different methods, sometimes it seems like children are able to get this task earlier, but it's definitely within early childhood that this is developing. It wouldn't be uncommon to see a 4-year-old not be able to correctly answer these conservation of mass tests. And that's down to just how their brain is processing this information. It's different than with more experience and with more connections and different areas of the brain connecting up to realize that, oh, that water is actually still the same. So children's brains are literally processing differently than yours and mine are. So it's interesting to think about. So let's talk about the zone of proximal development. We gave this as an example of a theory early on in the class, but let's talk about it in a little more detail today, and then we'll do an activity. Are we going to have time for our activity? Yes, we will have time for the activity. Good. So the social constructivist approach or theory essentially looks at social interactions, constructing learning, as well as constructing cognitive development, views of the world, things like that. But a lot of it's focused on the learning process. But the social constructivist is also, you're constructing your ideas about the world. It constructs how you develop cognitively. But it's applied most often today with learning exclusively. So children are experiencing their environment, people, social interactions, whether it's their caregivers, their family, their peers, whether they directly have a teacher, so say a preschool or a kindergarten or first grade teacher. Is first grade 5 or is first grade 6? I always forget the ages of the grades. First grade might be too far. So as children learn about the environment, this theory, the social constructivist theory, says that as they interact with their environment, it shapes how they think about the environment. So a child needs to learn the specific tools of a culture. So a child in Utah is probably going to be learning English as one tool of the culture, versus a child in another country is probably learning the language or languages that are most prevalent there. So that's an example of a tool that the culture is using. Also, traditions, habits that people do. So those are also tools of a culture. The ability to do math or how to do math is another example of a tool of a culture, which is pretty much the same worldwide. So with that, the use of emotions and what specific emotions. Another example of this is children from, what area was it? I think it was somewhere in Canada. So First Nation peoples in Canada. I forget what tribe it is though, offhand. Basically, they have a lot of different words for snow and ice. So a lot more descriptive than general people in Utah have for snow and ice. So because it's so central to their history and their lives. So understanding what type of ice was on the ocean or on a lake might suggest, well, can you walk on it? Can you not walk on it? That kind of thing. So there are a lot more descriptive words, descriptive terms for the different kinds of snow. So I mentioned to my kids the other day, oh, the snow is really wet. It'll be good for making snowmen. So wet versus dry is about the limit of my differentiations of snow types, versus they have, I think it's about 13 or 14 different words to describe ice and the type of ice it is, and then about that many to describe different snow types as well. So that is an example of a tool that was relevant to that culture and to that life that a child would need to learn through social interaction with other people. So reading, math, language, how a culture works. These are all examples of like the tools of that culture. So let's watch this quick video as a descriptor of what is the zone of proximal development. So the zone of proximal development is one model of how you increase your learning capacity based on this theory. So the theory is a social constructivist theory, and so it applies over a lot of things. The zone of proximal development is really focused specifically on applying that social constructivist theory to learning itself.
Let's talk about the zone of proximal development. Let's talk about what it is and how teachers can use it in the classroom. The psychologist's definition is the difference between what a student can do independently and what they can do with focused assistance. We can also think of this as a spectrum. One side will represent what students can do independently. This includes skills that are too easy for students because they've already been mastered. And that means there's no learning taking place. On the other side of the spectrum is what students cannot do on their own. Information here is too complicated and tasks are too hard for students to complete without direct assistance from the teacher. And again, no learning can take place. In between these two sides is what's known as a ZPD, or the zone of proximal development. A theory created by a psychologist of the name Lev Vygotsky. It suggests that there is what he calls a sweet spot for learning. He says that the ZPD is where instruction is most beneficial because it is just beyond a student's current level of individual capability. You see, Lev Vygotsky thought of learning and development in a series of steps. That is, once a student had mastered the information of one step, then and only then would they be ready to move on to the next step, which would be slightly more challenging in content. And once they'd mastered that step, then they would be able to move on to the next step, and so on. This next step is what Vygotsky meant when he said the sweet spot. And the best way to assist students at this step is by using what he calls scaffolding. But that's not all he thought was important. In fact, did you know that a student's social interaction with significant individuals, like teachers or peers or even parents, can profoundly shape not only the interpretation of the world, but also affect higher order thought processes? This means that students can learn a lot from working in groups or with the teacher, a lot more than they could on their own. And it brings us back to Vygotsky's main idea of scaffolding. Scaffolding is defined as structurally supportive interactions that guide effective learning. As a teacher, you can use scaffolding in a multitude of ways. You can use it by modeling behaviors. It can be as simple as walking all your students through the steps on how to fold a paper airplane, making sure they follow along with all the steps, that you're watching to make sure that they understand every step of the way as you yourself complete the task. You could also simplify problems, making sure to build on students' prior knowledge without making things too complicated. In fact, solving these slightly more challenging problems can actually be rewarding to students. And another way may be as simple as keeping their attention on the tasks. This means eliminating outside distractions or even keeping the task engaging and new. But what's the point? The point is that as a teacher, it may feel like your job is to orchestrate 100% success for a student and for your class, that you alone are responsible for their learning and their education. But it's not the case. Instead, by teaching in the ZPD, that is, using your instructions, plus some scaffolding, and maybe even some group interactions, group projects, or group discussions. You as a teacher can actually help your students get the most out of learning.
So hopefully those examples make it a little more clear what you would be using the zone of proximal development for as a teacher. So you can definitely use the zone of proximal development at any age of learning. It's still a really relevant idea that's come from this social constructivist theory that we've held on to, especially in education. So essentially the zone of proximal development is this purple area, what you can do with that support, with that scaffolding. So as you learn that, this circle of what you can do expands, and the circle of what you can do with help also expands. So learning Spanish, at the beginning, you might be able to count to 10 with Spanish, but with help, you can start to say some words, then get up to some sentences, maybe starting to read some Spanish. So what you can do expands, what you can do with help expands, and then what you can't do becomes more, this overlaps with what you can't do. So now things that you couldn't do before, with that support, now you can do. So this circle has grown. All the circles grow essentially. So you could also think of it as a positive upward spiral. As you are scaffolded, you can think of a scaffolding on a building, building even a spiral staircase. You help with that next step. You help in building that next step for a child in early childhood. And this also works with an adolescent, with an adult. So help them build that next skill. So teachers trying to get material down to an individual's level where they're at and meet them there and then help them stretch a little bit. That's essentially what the zone of proximal development is all about. And that's some of the things that I like to do with some of the assignments for class. For example, the question paper is hopefully helping you stretch. You've got what you're capable of now. You can stretch a little bit with some support and do even better with some of those skills. All right, so with that being said, you really are trying to find guidance that meets the needs of an individual child. The more individualized this is, the easier. So for parents, this might be easier to do. In smaller class sizes, this is obviously easier to do. As an example, this still applies to me. So I had a lot of direct instruction, like what we're having now in my undergrad, a lot of being talked to about things, a little bit towards my last couple of years of like internships and applied work, doing some research. But then as I got into my PhD program, even the first couple of years there was some flexibility. I was working as like I guess you could say an apprentice on projects. And in the end, now I'm running whole studies myself. So you're learning the skills as you build. If you think about it, an apprenticeship and like a master position for any kind of skill, whether it's plumbing or electrician work, mechanics work, you're learning the skills. You might already know how to change a tire, but you've never changed brakes before. So getting support, being told how to do that. Maybe YouTube is teaching you that within that zone of proximal development. That's how I've learned to do most of the mechanical things on my car, as an example. So that direct instruction at that next step to help you stretch a little bit, that's what the zone of proximal development is all about, to expand that circle of what we can do so that things that we couldn't do before, we're now capable of. So let's do an activity to apply that zone of proximal development. One thing that you really need to do is assess a child's zone of proximal development. Figure out where are they at. So standardized tests might not be really great for that. You might be able to get a grade. So our exam, we had a grade, but really how I can understand if you're understanding certain concepts is by going through individually on the items and see, oh, a lot of students had trouble with this problem. In this case, on the most recent exam, there were a couple topics, but most of it was, oh, that was a confusing worded question. That's why so many students missed that question. So active activities with problems of various difficulties, helping students apply those things. And this can be hard to do in, say, a public school setting if you've got so many children, because it makes it harder to assess an individual child's zone of proximal development, what they're capable of. There's a lot of online tools now that so many students have moved to online work that do a really good job actually at assessing an individual student's needs. So from that, my teacher or my child's teacher let me know the other day she's having trouble with subtracting with replacement. So that's something that she still needs some scaffolding on, so we can support her with that. So that's an example. Skilled peers can be good teaching tools as well. So as an example, putting a student next to another student, especially in early childhood, in a classroom. So the one student's really good at math, this student isn't very good. It can help support that student. So not just by giving them the answers, but the other student might explain it in a different way, help encourage them, those kinds of things. So using private speech for problem solving, I still do this myself today. Every once in a while, my wife will yell from like the other side of the house, "Were you talking to me?" And no, I wasn't. I was talking to myself, trying to solve a problem that I was working on. So I still use that one. So it's not just for children. Maybe it's just for children and me. But make sure that the context for instruction is really meaningful. So play learning is really good. Solving problems in person that are relevant. So math with money is more relevant if you talk about it in the sense of, hey, look, a Hatchimal is this much money. You have this much money. How much money do you need to be able to buy the Hatchimal? So another good set of tools is the Tools of Mind curriculum. We're not actually going to watch this together. It just kind of goes over a bunch of different tools for learning within the zone of proximal development and other aspects of socio-emotional learning too. But the Tools of the Mind curriculum is a good set of learning tools for school and socio-emotional factors. So we're going to jump into our groups now. As a reminder, how you get into your groups is you'll come and click on your Teams icon, and then you will jump into whichever group corresponds with your last name. So, so my room would be this last one, because my last name starts with R. And we do have most students in here today, so we should be able to hopefully fill up those rooms with enough students. So jump into those groups, and obviously you don't have to write your names on a paper, but together you'll complete this activity. So essentially, choose a subject. So the first thing to do as a group is, once you get into there, choose a subject that might be seen in first grade. And then talk about how you would use the zone of proximal development and write some guidelines for both assessing and teaching that subject to a child in first grade. So some topics that you might see in first grade are things like reading. You might see socio-emotional learning like group work and sharing. You might see some math, some basic math, so like addition, subtraction of one or even two numbers. Science, so a lot of first graders in Utah are going through the life cycle and the water cycle. And then social studies, so learning how to read maps, learning a little bit about history, learning about types of jobs. These are all subjects that a first grader might encounter. So first thing to do is choose which subject your group is going to think of some teaching guidelines for. And then think of what kind of things would scaffold a child. How might they learn how to do something like read a map? What would be a good way to use that zone of proximal development, active learning, group work, things like that, to teach these skills, to teach reading? And then how might you also assess it? So think first about how you would teach that, how you would build that scaffolding, and then think about how you might assess it as well. So this will probably take the whole rest of the time. So write some notes as you do this. I'm not sure if we'll have time to come back and share by the end of class. But get to work. I'll see where everybody is, and hopefully we have a couple minutes, like 5 minutes at the end, to come back together. So jump in those groups. First thing, choose a subject. Here's some suggestions. And then how would you build a scaffolding for children to learn the skill or thing that you're talking about? All right, go for it. So for anyone here in the general meeting right now, your group might have been finished up with your ideas. There's a couple groups still pretty active in thinking of scaffolding, like ways to scaffold, ways to assess. I think every group actually picked reading as the topic as well, which is good. It makes it so it'll be easy for us to discuss. So if your group is already done and you're here in the general meeting room, feel free to take off. I'm going to jump in every single one of these small group meeting rooms and let everybody know that at 9:50 when class is done, to make sure they've written down some things so we can talk about it first thing next time, but take off at that point. So thank you all for being here today. And I really wonder if I'm even talking to anybody right now or if you're still in all your small group rooms. But have a good day.